This show is intended for general purposes only, as individual situations may vary. Statements made should not be relied upon as recommendations or solicitation. When discussed, past performance is no guarantee or indication of future results. Nelson Financial Planning offers securities through Nelson Ivest Brokerage Services, member FINRA, and SIPC.
Good Sunday morning. This is Bud Hettinger. Next on News Radio 102.5 WFLA, the longest-running radio show in Central Florida, Dollars and Cents, with my good friend Joel Garris from Nelson Financial Planning. You can call him at the office this week at 407-629-6477 to schedule your free consultation to discuss your retirement plans. Or you can talk to him right now at 407-916-5400.
Well, my goodness, good morning. What's the difference between a rollover or a transfer? And should we really feel sorry for the millennials and their investing behavior? Well, maybe we should, right? We should feel sorry for anybody if they're not investing correctly. Good morning. This is Joel Garris, Nelson Financial Planning. You're listening to Dollars and Cents here on News Radio 102.5 WFLA. Let's talk about those millennials. This is a survey that comes to us courtesy of the Heritage Planning Program, and it is a survey that was done recently involving investor concerns and sort of what sort of keeps people up at night. And what was interesting about the study was when they looked at that age group that is generally referred to as the millennials. So that would be people that today are between the ages of 21 and 36. And frankly, I think the biggest issue that age group has is they are tremendously saddled with student loan debt. I mean, that's probably the biggest financial issue I think that age group does, because they kind of got crushed by these colleges and universities and these online schools and the online degree programs that really are expensive and just for whatever reason continue to think that they can increase their costs 4 or 5 or 6% every year. I don't know any other industry, well, maybe healthcare, but that's a different conversation, that increases the cost of their product that much, that regularly. Stop and think about it. Anyway, the survey looked at millennials, ages 21 to 36, and 7 in 10 were saying that they were optimistic about their future. As a matter of fact, that age group versus the other age groups was actually the most confident about their financial future, and that makes sense. I think when you're younger, you're full of confidence without, unfortunately, the doses of reality that life gives you along the way. So that would make sense. Here, I think what was the two interesting pieces of it, though. 60% feel overwhelmed by the number of investment choices. Overwhelmed. Wait a minute. I thought we live in an era of the internet and information and it's all accessible. I thought that was all supposed to make our lives easier. Has it? Overwhelmed. Even the ones that are technologically savvy, and let's face it, the millennials are more technologically savvy than the rest of us because they grew up with the technology. To have over half of them feeling overwhelmed by the number of investment choices, I think is an interesting statement. Unfortunately, what has happened is the industry, the financial services industry, has jumped on that and sort of dumbed down the choices, right? You look at a traditional 401k today, and for the most part, you're going to have a bunch of target date type funds. Just put in your birthday, and we'll tell you which fund you should own. It's that simple, if only it were. What you wind up with when you do that is something that is going to be much more conservative, much higher level of bond allocation than you realize, because that's how those target date funds run, is they run on a much more conservative basis than they would otherwise. So be careful of that. Here's the other part of it. 7 in 10, again, referring to millennial investors, 7 in 10 say that their primary investment objectives are to grow their assets. 7 in 10. Okay? Here's the problem. 3 out of 10, a third of that is allocating, has more than a third of their allocation is to cash and CDs. So if you want to grow your assets, I don't know what math you're doing, but if you've got money in a cash or certificates of deposit and they're making like 1%, I mean, it's going to take 72 years for that money to double in value. That seems like an awful long time. How can you say that your investment objective is fixated on growth when the reality is that you've got a huge chunk of your money sitting in cash and certificates of deposit? That, folks, is a perfect example of the kind of investment allocation that you should not have if you want growth. Unfortunately, in this era of constant news cycle, information that bombards us on a regular basis, it is not, in fact, leading to better choices. 60% of that younger generation is overwhelmed by the number of investment choices. And what do you do when you're overwhelmed? Well, you pick the easiest thing. Unfortunately, that means that you're not getting anywhere near the return that you should be getting. So now you've got two problems, right? Or that generation has two problems. Student loan debt, which is a big giant mess, and being way too conservative on their investment allocation. Folks, student loan debt can't be solved overnight if you've got it, but your investment allocation can. So we encourage you, particularly if you're in that millennial age group, ages 21 to 36 right now, to take a look at your investment allocation and really look at, if you want it for growth, then make sure that you are way more on the stock side of things than you are on the bond side of things. Certainly some interesting statistics, some interesting survey responses in that survey that we wanted to share with you here at the top of the program. We also posted recently on our Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn an interesting article about some of the steps for you to follow when you retire in your 50s. So we'll tackle that after this. We're back. Welcome back to the program. Joel Garris. This is Dollars and Cents, News Radio 102.5 WFLA. So you're thinking about retiring and you're thinking about, man, I'd like to retire sooner rather than later. So what are the things that you can do to retire in your 50s? This is actually courtesy of an article from U.S. News and World Report. It's a good article. We've got some decent thoughts, and we'll share it with you. If you're interested in reading the full article, we did post it on our Facebook page and on Twitter and all that sorts of thing here a few weeks back. So you can certainly find it out on that. If you're not connected to us on any of those social media locations, to do so, it's pretty easy. You just got to search for Nelson Financial Planning, or on LinkedIn, you just search for me personally, Joel Garris, and then poof, lo and behold, we're connected. So here are some of the things that the article talks about that we thought it would be good to share with you. Some of this is pretty self-evident, particularly the first one that they list, which is make as much money as you can. Well, no kidding, okay? If you want to retire early, make as much money as you can. Here's a caveat to that, okay? Make as much money as you can. Most importantly, save as much money as you can, because it's one thing to make money, but if you're spending all of it, then, you're not getting ahead. So start the process of saving from that very first paycheck. One of the ideas that we suggest the folks in the office, which I think is a good rule to follow, is every time your pay increases, increase your savings by that amount. Look, let's face it, if you were living on your old salary just fine, then if your salary is going up, rather than just have that extra money sloshing around in the old checking account, increase the amount of money that you're putting towards savings based upon the increase in that salary. Another suggestion in the article talks about building up non-qualified assets. Non-qualified assets, basically non-retirement assets. And here's the key concept there is, we talk about saving for retirement, and most people generally think of that as, okay, I'm going to contribute money to my 401k at work, or maybe I'm going to open up an IRA and contribute money that way. And that's all fine and good, and you certainly want to do that, particularly because you get a tax benefit when you do that. Because when you're putting money in to those types of accounts and you do so on a pre-tax basis, then ultimately you're getting some level of tax savings. So that's a good thing. When you look at other types of accounts that you can have, generally those are referred to as non-qualified. Qualified accounts are going to be retirement type accounts, 401ks, IRAs, things like that. A non-qualified account then is money that is after tax money, meaning you've already paid the taxes on it, and it to a certain extent it is sort of like money that you've got sitting in your checking account, same accessibility, without a whole lot of tax implications. Should you use that money, and that's why it's important to save that, particularly if you're trying to retire early in your 50s, because most of those qualified or retirement pure accounts have the age of 59 and a half on them. There are some exceptions on that, but generally the age of 59 and a half is when you can access those without having to pay a 10% penalty. Combined with the fact that when you use those qualified or retirement accounts, you've got to pay and report all of the money you take out as taxable income on your tax return, and that's taxed as ordinary income. In contrast, a non-qualified account, when you take that, the money that you put in was already taxed. So the portion that represents the part of the money that you originally invested, you don't have to pay any tax on. So it's much greater tax efficiency to use those types of assets, and then you only have to pay based upon the capital gain or the dividend. Well, the capital gain and the dividend is taxed at a lower rate than your income tax rates. If you're in the 25% income tax rate, your dividends and capital gain rates is actually 15%. If you're in the 15% income tax rate, guess what? Your tax rate for your capital gains and dividends is actually zero. So you can see where there's a little bit, not a little bit, a lot of a tax advantage on those non-qualified, combined with the fact that you can use them at any age. So again, thinking of trying to retire early in your 50s, well, you're not 59 and a half yet, so that kind of puts the traditional retirement types of accounts off limits, which is why, if you're looking to do that, why it is important to shift that money or have that chunk of money in those non-qualified types of accounts. Another good suggestion is to try and accelerate the payoff of the mortgage. Because if you're going to go into retirement, right, then you need to make sure that your expenses are as low as possible so that you can actually use your income in retirement to do the fun things that you want to do in retirement. So one of the ways that you do that, or usually one of the biggest payments that we have on a monthly basis, whether we're working or whether we're working or hopefully not when we're retired, but it's going to be the mortgage payment. So if you can tie the payoff of your mortgage to when you anticipate retiring, then you have really improved your cash flow for retirement. And then that way you can turn around and use those dollars to ultimately do fun stuff in retirement. So take a look at your debt. If you're looking to retire early, take a look at your debt and really look at, okay, what's the timetable that I can put this on to make sure that it is paid off when, in fact, I actually retire. A few other suggestions in the article. Ultimately, spending less and getting used to living on less on a regular basis is another way to be able to retire early. Looking at different streams of income is another good suggestion, where you want to have different types of accounts doing different things at different points in time. And if you almost think of it like establishing a system or a tier of baskets where different assets are going to be available at different points in time to generate out income. That's another good way to kind of address trying to retire early at 50. And then the article gives a few other suggestions as well. But all in all, some solid suggestions, which is why we thought it was a good article to post out of U.S. News and World Report on the various social media channels. So look for that out there. Some good stuff and some good suggestions, particularly if you are looking to try and retire earlier. And after all, who isn't, right? Then those are some suggestions to follow. So the next segment we're going to dedicate to the difference between rollovers versus transfers. So stay tuned for that. This is Joel Garris, Nelson Financial Planning. You're listening to Dollars and Cents on News Radio 102.5 WFLA. We're back here on Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris, News Radio 102.5 WFLA. You know, these words get used very interchangeably. The rollover word, then the transfer word, and when you're talking about retirement assets, and they are in fact quite different. And a rollover means that you took receipt of those assets. Okay? And that's the harder one to deal with, because there's a lot of rules as it relates to the rollover that you must observe. Because if you don't, guess what? Then you're going to have some pretty severe tax implications. So we'll cover those rules in just a sec. Transfer, on the other hand, is simply moving those retirement assets from one custodian over to another custodian without those funds going through your hands. And let me be very, very clear. If you're moving retirement accounts around, maybe you're changing who's helping you on those, or maybe you're changing jobs, or maybe you're moving out of the 401k into an IRA, look, you really need to be doing that as a transfer. I understand that the world refers to that as a rollover, but that's not what you want to be doing. You want to be doing that as a transfer, because that means that it's going from one custodian to the other, and that is free of any and all potential landmines for you. Here's the problem with a rollover. A rollover, and again, the distinction between a rollover and transfer is a rollover, you're taking possession of the money. A transfer is going from custodian to custodian. A rollover, you've got to get that money in another account within 60 days. Folks, the IRS does not mess around with that rule. Okay? We've actually encountered somebody that did it in 63 days, and it was disallowed. There's no exceptions on that 60-day. It's 60 days. Okay? Well, look, why take that chance? Why mess around with it? Why put yourself at risk for that? Don't do a rollover. Do a transfer. Another issue with the rollover, and this is something that is new that the IRS is also looking at, you're only allowed one per year. And the IRS is looking at that very carefully. And that's a relatively new rule, but it is the rule. So there's a couple of sets of rules, the timing and the frequency, that you've got to be pretty observant on for a rollover to avoid any and all taxation. Because if you don't observe those rules, you're going to owe taxes on that money. Worse yet, if you're under 59 and a half, you're going to have to pay a 10% penalty on it. All because you just didn't do it the right way with some paperwork. If you do the paperwork and you do it correctly and you do it as a transfer, none of these issues happen. Okay? That allows you much greater flexibility and avoids having to run into any issue whatsoever. Transfers, you're allowed unlimited transfers during the course of any year. You could transfer it from trustee A to trustee B to custodian C to custodian D, all within the course of a year. No issues whatsoever. Unlimited amounts of transfers. If you roll it over, you only get one shot. And if you don't satisfy the timing on it, then you wind up having to pay taxes and a 10% penalty. Okay? Very important to understand the distinction between the rollover and a transfer. Okay? Say you took, and we'll give a specific example of each, just to really drive that point home. Okay, so say you took $30,000 out of your IRA and you intended to open a new IRA account with a new advisor. Okay? You take the $30,000, you go to the current location, you say, give me a check for $30,000. They give you a check for $30,000. You take the check for $30,000, you put it in your checking account, whereupon you then write a check to the new IRA. Okay? As long as you do that within 60 days, that is a perfect example of a rollover. Okay? If you wait 3 months to do it, you're out of luck. You owe taxes and a 10% penalty. Meanwhile, okay, let's use the example of you leave your employer, okay, and you decide I'm gonna take my 401k and move them, okay, over to my IRA. You go through the paperwork, you check the box that it's going to be a check payable directly to the IRA, okay. The check comes to you, but here's the thing, because you filled the paperwork out correctly, it's made payable to the new IRA. And folks, a lot of 401ks, when you do this, they won't send the check to a third-party address. They will send the check to you as a security feature on the account because they know the address on the account, and that's what they know that's related to that account. So if you tell them to send it to a third-party address, that's going to be a different issue. So they may send you the check, but so long as the check is made payable to the new custodian, then that's not a rollover. Even though you sort of took possession of the check, okay, the check, so long as it's made payable to the new custodian, that money doesn't flow through your hands. The check got to your hands, but not the money. That is an example of a transfer. Even though you took possession of the check, it's still a transfer. The rollover is when you actually physically get receipt of the cash. It goes into your account, and ultimately you wind up having it in your checking account, okay? So the answer is, okay, you've really got to make sure that you're doing this process correctly because you wind up running afoul of some pretty stringent IRS rules if you do not. So again, the distinction between rollover and a transfer. Rollover, where you're taking possession of it, you really got to observe the rules in terms of timing and frequency. You're only allowed to do that once per year now. Transfer, meanwhile, avoid all of that and can transfer it as much and as often as you want. So a pretty big distinction when we're talking about rollovers versus transfers. Everybody uses the word rollover, but the reality is what you really want to be thinking about is a transfer, because a rollover has a couple of minefields in it that can really trigger some significant tax consequence. So the next time you're thinking about moving your IRA or moving your 401k, think transfer, not rollover. A pretty important distinction, if you will, between those terms. When we get back here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris on News Radio 102.5 WFLA, we're going to talk about some of the questions that you should ask to get a handle on what your true investment cost is. We'll cover that when we get back right after this. Here we are, back for our last segment here on Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris, News Radio 102.5 WFLA. Covered a lot of territory so far in the program. Hopefully you found it informative. If you missed part of it, of course, on Monday is when we posted on the various social media channels, our Facebook, our Twitter, and LinkedIn as well. If you want to connect with us on that stuff, you just have to look for Nelson Financial Planning, or in the case of LinkedIn, you would look for me personally, Joel Garris, and get connected, because then that way, if you miss a part of the program, you can always listen to that part that you missed. Along with that's where a lot of the articles that we talk about on the program, the full copy of those articles is made available on media. So in the last segment, we talked about the difference between rollovers and transfers. Pretty important distinction there. And then early in the program, we talked about some of the steps that you can take if you'd like to retire early. Let's say you want to retire in your 50s. What are some of the things that you can do to help make that a possibility? And then lastly, some of the issues with millennial investors and the fact that their investments aren't really connected to what they want as their investment objective. If you want growth, then you probably shouldn't be sitting in cash, because that's not how you're going to get growth. And speaking of growth, one of the things that can retard your growth from an investment perspective is, of course, this notion of cost. And cost really is an important consideration that you really want to be considering as it relates to your investments. And we hear a lot about costs in the industry as a whole, and there's so many different flavors of costs in this industry today that I think it is really only generating confusion for the investor. And it's fascinating how much the industry has changed over the course of the past 20 years, and kind of what has evolved and what has changed. And certainly you hear all the various different words thrown out there. Is it a fee? Is it a commission? Are you fee only? Are you load? Is it a 12B1? Is it an investment advisory fee? All kinds of different things. Okay. And as an aside, and this is a personal opinion, I think in a lot of ways the industry has done a disservice to investors in going through this sort of bifurcation type process, right? Oh, well, we're going to charge you a fee, so that's going to make us independent. But what about the investments that you're using? Well, and that we're recommending. Well, don't they have an underlying fee? And it doesn't matter whether it's a no-load fund or an ETF fund or whatever it is. All of that stuff has an underlying expense, and unless you take the time to add up all of the parts, you're never going to get a true representation of how much something is going to cost you. And what the financial services industry has done over the course of the past 10 or 20 years is they've done a great job at making you look at one thing over here, while at the same time distracting you from the other costs that may be over here. And the reality is you've got to combine those two. You hear a lot about the fees or the commissions or the loads or the fee only or the investment advisor fees. Look, the important thing is always to add those numbers up. So there really has to be two core questions that you need to ask about any investment services or financial planning services or financial services or whatever the name is that they're calling it, okay? You've got to ask a couple of different questions that are of primary importance. Number one, how much is that person being compensated? Okay? And by the way, if anybody looks at you and says that you don't pay it, let me tell you something. You do. You may not pay it directly out of your pocket, but somewhere along the way you pay it because it ain't for free. So if anybody says you don't pay it, walk out the door, because that's not a straight answer. The answer is there has to be some way that the individual is making money because they got to pay the light bill. And they're not in business as a charity. how much is the compensation that's being paid directly to the individual that is helping you. Now, not just to the individual that's helping you, but to the firm in which that individual works. Because, see, what happens is in this industry, compensation flows into the firm that the person works for. Generally, the firm keeps a piece of that, and another piece goes to the individual. Make sure you understand what the total cost is, okay? Look, it's a total cost to you. It doesn't matter whether it's going to the firm or whether it's going to the individual, or the individual that you're dealing with is only getting this. There's still the other part of the cost. So make sure you understand what the total compensation looks like that's being paid on the investment product that you are getting into. And that can be in the form of a load, that can be in the form of a fee, that can be in the form of a commission, it can be in the form of a management fee, whatever it is, whatever the name is, it's a cost. That's the first piece of the cost. What is the compensation that the person is making? Anybody tells you that you don't have to worry about it? Worry about it. Okay? The second part, what are the underlying expenses of the investments that are being used? If they're ETFs, if they're index funds, if they're no-load funds, if they're low, whatever they are, okay, there has to be an underlying expense to owning those investments. The younger the product is, the higher the expenses. It's just the way it goes, okay? So if you're looking at mutual funds that have only a 3-year or 5-year track record, their internal expenses are going to be higher than, say, for example, a fund that's been around for 50 years. Okay? So you've got to get a handle on that. How much is the compensation that's getting paid? What's the expenses on the underlying investment that I'm going to be using? Pay particular attention if the underlying investment happens to have an insurance component to it. Because there's two sets of cost. There's the cost of the underlying investment piece in the insurance product, and then there's also the cost of the insurance. So you got to add all of those pieces up to make sure you have a fundamental understanding of what your total cost is. This article is a New York Times article, the 21 questions you're going to need to ask about investment fees. A great article that starts the conversation. In our mind, and we posted this on our social media, in our mind, it breaks down to two questions. What's the compensation that's getting paid out? Doesn't matter who it's going to. What's the total amount? And then ultimately, what's the underlying expenses of the investments that you fundamentally wind up with? Add those two together, and you'll get your total cost. Hope you enjoyed the program, ladies and gentlemen. The music means we are out of here. This is Joel Garris. You've listened to another edition of Dollars and Cents here on News Radio 102.5 WFLA.
This is Bud Hettinger, and you've been listening to Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. If you missed any part of today's show or want to listen to it again, check out the radio show at www.nelsonfinancialplanning.com or connect with them on Facebook or Twitter. Be sure to call Joel this week at 407-629-6477 to schedule your free consultation to discuss your retirement plan.